Shavua Tov. We're on Daf Nun Beis Amid Beis, and let's review the last piece that we did on Yom Chamishi, Taner Rabbanan. So we're looking at about, I would say, close to 15 lines down from the top, and the Brisa records a machlokes between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Taner Rabbanan Peiros sheyatzu me'eretz Yisrael lechutz la'aretz. Where is the Chiyuv B'Iyun if I take Peiros from Eretz Yisrael and I bring them to chutz la'aretz? So you may recall that we presented a controversy on this issue. Can he fulfill his chovas biur wherever he is on the face of the map, or does he have to take the Peiros back to Eretz Yisrael in order to fulfill his mitzvah biur? And the Tanakama says, Misbarim b'chol makom shehem. There's no need to be matriach yourself to schlep the Peiros back to Eretz Yisrael. Rav Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Yachzeru l'mkomon. You have to bring them back to Eretz Yisrael. Misbaru mishum shenemar. The pasuk says in Parshas Bahar and the Parshas Shvius, Bi'artzecha. We'll read the whole pasuk. It says, Uvehem t'chol l'chai asher bi'artzecha. And it's got to be bi'artzecha. So the Gemara immediately asks the kasha ha'afikte. We need this drasha bi'artzecha for another limud, and that is that we need the pasuk bi'artzecha to teach us that in a situation where the Peiros were kolu in one eretz and not kolu in another eretz, it all depends upon the situation in that particular eretz. So the Gemara answers, Kari be eretz bi'artzecha. It could have said one word bi'aretz. That would have taught me that the din of biur depends upon the bnei eretz achas and not bnei eretz acheres. But why did the Torah have to add bi'artzecha and inami? So therefore we have two drashos, and may asher bi'artzecha, the Gemara offers the second possibility that the word asher. So now the Gemara embarks upon an investigation. Do we paskin l'chumra like Reb Shimon ben Elazar? They have to schlep your Peiros all the way back to Eretz Yisrael in order to fulfill the mitzvah biur. So Gemara tells the story of Safra, Nefak me Eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz, Havi ba'adei garva dechama d'shvius. So Rav Safra is carrying wine of shvius with him to chutz la'aretz from Eretz Yisrael, and he was escorted lavu ba'adei by Rav Huna, Breder of Ikov Rav Kana. These are the two outstanding students of Rabbi Avo. Amalahu, so Rav Safra turns to them and he asks, Ika de Shmile Minei de Rav Avo, Halachik Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Olo. Is there one of you perhaps that can clarify for me what was the final psak of your Rebbe Rabbi Avo? Did he accept the chumrah of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? And here he gets two answers. That's par for the course. He has to tell me them what the Rebbe said. You'll get two different answers. Amalei Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana said, "Hochi Omer Rabbi Yavo Aloch Rav Shimon ben Elazar." So according to Rav Kahana, you have to be machmir. Amalei Rav Huna, Berei Rav Ika. Rav Huna had a different version, and according to his transmission, Hochi Omer Rabbi Yavo ain't Aloch Rav Shimon ben Elazar. We pass like the Tanakama. So there's no need to bother yourself with the whole hassle of bringing your fruits back to Eretz Yisrael. And now Rav Safra has to make a decision. Should he rely on the version of Kahana, in which case he has to be machmir, or can he accept the more lenient transmission of Rav Huna? So Rav Safra makes the following declaration. Nekot ha klala. You should accept the following rule when you have two versions, one from Rav Kahana, one from Rav Huna, about what the Rabbi Avo said. is the Rav Huna biyadcha, except the formulation of Rav Huna. He's the more reliable transmitter. And the reason is the Dayak v'Gomar Shmaitito Mipumei D'Rabbei. He's very careful to transmit the Torah exactly as he heard it from his Rebbe. And I'll give you a mashal, he says, I'll give you an example of another Talmud who's also very, very meticulous about how to transmit the Torah of his Rebbe. Kimo Rechava de Pumbedisa. Rechava, an Amora who came from the city of Pumbedisa. And now the Gemara is going to give us one example of how Rechava was very careful about the Torah that he got from Rabbi Yehuda, his Rebbe. The Omar Rechava, Omar Rabbi Yehuda, he says in the name of his Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda, Harabayis Stav Kafel Haya. They set up benches all around the Harabayis, and not only one row of benches, but a second row, which is kafel. And that's how many benches there were, whatever would fill up the perimeters, the outer perimeters of the Harabayis. And this made the Harabayis a very comfortable place to be. It's like, I don't know if you ever had the experience where it started raining, and in certain cities you have a roofed station, where you wait for the bus. So you run to get cover under the roof. So they made these benches in a very comfortable way to protect them from rain. So people who had to come onto the Harabayis and were encouraged to do so would find a place to find refuge from the rain. And there was one row inside the other row, meaning there were two rows. And the Gemara tells us that Rechava was very careful in the way he presented the words of his Rebbe, Rav Yehuda. Why? Because actually there are two Rav Yehudas. There was a Tana Rav Yehuda, and then there was Rav Yehuda Nasi. And as you know, Rav Yehuda Nasi was the author of the Mishnayos. And in the Mishnayos itself, when he describes the benches on the Harabayis, he calls it an itztaba, which is another way in Aramaic of saying a stav kafel. But Rechava went out of his way to avoid the language of the Mishnah itztaba, but rather use the language that he heard from his Rebbe, Rav Yehuda, and that was stav kafel. And that would make it clear that it's not necessarily Rebbe, meaning Rav Yehuda Kadosh of the Mishnayos. It could be that he heard it from Rav Yehuda. In any event, there's a lot of detail here in the Mefarshim that I don't think we have to go into. Rachva was an example, a prime example of someone who went out of his way to use the language that his Rebbe used in order to clarify the transmission of the Torah. However, it's interesting. The Gemara ends this sugya with a comment, a kind of a pejorative comment of Rav Yosef, shedding a little bit of a negative light on Rav Safra. If you remember, Rav Safra had a choice between accepting the chumrah of Rav Kahana, which would force him to go back to Eretz Yisrael with the Peres Shvius, or accepting the transmission of Rav Huna, brother Rav Ika, which was more lenient, that we pass like the Chachamim against Rav Shimon ben Elazar, and we don't require schlepping the Peres all the way back. And Rav Safra took the easy way out, Lakula. And Rav Yosef wasn't satisfied with that. Apparently, he had a little bit of a gripe about this, as if to say, you have two choices, take the kula. And Rav Yosef apparently did not think that there was enough of a justification to accept the kula simply because amongst these two Talmidim of Rabbi Avo, meaning Rav Kahana and Rav Huna was much more meticulous in his Masorah. So therefore, the Gemara ends this story by saying, Kari alei Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef had a pasuk in Hosea, and the pasuk sort of castigates the Jewish people. And it says, Ami b'yetzo yish'al u'maklo yagid lo. And this pasuk actually is the tochacha of Klal Yisrael on their avonos, and they were involved at that time in different kinds of immorality, and they drank certain wines that they weren't allowed to eat, allowed to drink. And when it says be'etzo yishal umakolo yagidlo, he's asking, like, which is the derech to get from one pestle that's made of wood or a stick that's made of wood. These were the questions they were asking because they were involved in these kinds of lower activities. But the word makil can be understood in two ways. One meaning of makil is that it's a piece of wood that has a life to it. And the other way is to say that makil is miloshin lahakel, to find the leniency. And Rav Yosef wants to say, al pi derech hadrush, that this pasuk in Yeshayahu is referring, in Hosea, is referring not to makil as a piece of wood, but rather to be makil, whoever rules leniently. And it's a negative comment, a disparaging comment. He says the plain meaning of the verse is that people believed in idols made of wood and rods. Rav Yosef devises a play on the word makel that could mean both a rod and to be lenient. Thus, umaklo means whoever rules leniently for him, meaning Rav Safra in this case, yagidlo. In other words, when Rav Safra hears two opinions, whoever is makil, yagidlo, that's the one that Rav Safra will endorse. He takes that opinion of the makil. All right. So that's the sugya that we started on Yom Chamishi. So we just wanted to finish that one up. And now we start a new sugya. Now, we're about to embark upon a gigantic sugya of Shvius. And let me say the following. I have no problem learning Shvius with you. It's going to require work. I have to brush up. I mean, I learned Shvius many, many years ago. I don't remember too much. And this is a very extensive sugya. It has to do with Bosar and Smodar and the relationship between Shvius and Orla. It's heavy, heavy Zroin. So I made the following decision. I hope you'll go along with me on this. That since we're learning Masechta Pesachim, if we want to take upon ourselves, some more, shall I say, challenging areas of Pesachim, I think Shvius would be lower on the list. I would rather learn with you more of Pesach, meaning Korban Pesach. Therefore, I want to try my hand, not today. Today I prepared Shvius, so we'll get a little bit of a haschol on Shvius. But I'd like to start tomorrow, B'li Neder, in the 7th parak, which is one of the prakim on Pesach Sheni. I mean, it's called Pesach Sheni, meaning it's Korban Pesach. And that's called Ketzad Solin Es HaPesach. And we'll see, it's an experiment of sorts. If it goes, it goes. If it doesn't go, we could always change our minds. So that begins on Daf Ayin Dalet. Okay, so we're skipping Ad all the way to Ayin Dalet. Rabbi Loi cuts kafnaisa deshvius. The word kafnaisa is a description of a tree, and the dates on this palm tree are called kufre. So you'll see soon in the Gemara the word kufre. I'm just introducing it now. Kufre are very small, immature dates, way before they've matured. And they are still covered by chaff. Later on, when they start getting more mature and they grow larger, they drop, the chaff falls off. Now we're talking about a date tree on Shvius. The peros of Shvius, the Torah says, "V'hoya Shabbat ha'aretz lachem li'achla," which means that the peros of Shvius are endowed with kedusha, which expresses itself in achila. It has to be eaten, like we have certain parts of kodshim, and Ma'aser Sheni has to be eaten. We have many examples of that which is sanctified, and the key of mitzvah, so the nitan, is achil. You're not allowed to destroy them. Truma, for example, you're not allowed to destroy truma. So to Shvius, you're not allowed to destroy truma. The Torah says li'achla, v'lo lehefsid. You cannot be mafsid peros of Shvius. Now, in this case, he didn't take the peros and destroy them, but rather he cut down the tree. Right? I cannot tell a lie. Like, he cut down the tree. And as a result, the dates died. They were no longer attached to the tree. And the dates had Kedusha Shvius. And the Gemara is going to go through a very long sugya here, in which up front it tries to critique Rabbi Eloi that he had no right to cut down this tree because the parents on the tree were endowed with Kedusha Shvius, li'achla v'lo lehefsed. And the Gemara tries to argue that perhaps Rabbi Eloi was convinced, which itself is machlokas tanoim, that at this stage, what we call the stage of kufre, on this kafnais, again, kafnais is the description of the tree, the fruits are only kufre, they do not have the status of a pri, but rather they are part of the eights. So you have two choices. When a fruit begins to blossom in a very early stage on the tree, you can either call it tree or you could call it a fruit. And in the case of Shvius, for example, the nafkamina is going to be whether you can destroy those peros. In the case of Orla, for example, you have the same identical question. Orla, for the first 3 years, the peros are asur noah. Are these peros or it's eights? The eights itself, the bark of the wood, for example, the body of the tree, is mutar noah. So therefore I can eat those so-called fruits that are not halachically fruits yet because they don't have what's called the shem peri. I mean, these are sugyas also in brachos, in case of mevarchim, that we touched upon once, about whether you make a bar priya eights on kafri, because it's such an early stage in the development of the fruit that it's still considered eights. Lo yotza michlal eights, v'adayin lo nichnas lechlal pri. Can't call it pri eights. Want to make a bar pri adam on it, perhaps a shackle. And in Hilchas Roim, that's a tremendous nafkamina, because if it has the status of a pri, it's orla in the first 3 years, asur mana. If it's shvius, then halacha is li'achla v'lo lehefsid. You're not allowed to cut down a tree that has these peros on. So this is the real kishkis of the issue here that's going to go on and on and on as to whether or not these kufre, which are very immature and small dates on the tree, are considered eights or they considered pri. And Rav Eloi took the license of cutting down this tree that had kufri on it. Apparently he was of the opinion that since the fruits are very immature, they still have the status of eights, and the Torah doesn't object to cutting down the eights. Now we have another issue here called baltashkas. But he needed the tree. And the tree was worth to him more as eights, meaning as cut down logs of wood, than it would be in its capacity to produce fruit. And once he makes that shikul, and he decides that it's worth it for him to cut down this tree, then it's not considered derech hashchasa, and it doesn't come under baltashkas. So the issue here is one issue, and that's it. And that's the question of shvius. Gemara immediately objects. Heichi ovid hachi. What gives Rabbi Eloi the heter to cut down this tree that has on it kufri? So you're going to tell me, well, these kafnios are so, have dates that are so immature, but the dates are still growing. I can see them on the tree. They should have the status of a pri. And li'achla marachmana v'lo lehefsed, as we said before. And if you'll say no, there's no mitzvah li'achla at this point in the early development of the fruit. Hanimili, when do we have a mitzvah li'achla? That's only when it has the status of a pri. And therefore you need a gemar pri, and only when it's at that advanced stage of maturation, only then it becomes a pri. But here, in the case of the kufri, meaning these small dates, it's not a gemar pri, and if it's not a gemar pri, it's not a pri, and if it's not a pri, it's eights, and therefore there's no isur. If it's lo nigma pri, it doesn't have a shem pri. Are you telling me that you need gemar pri in order for it to be a pri and to generate an isur of liachav v'lo lehefsed? V'amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avua hani maschale di orlasire. Maschale means there are husks that cover the dates, and they protect the dates. That's nature's protection of the dates. But the husks are only on the dates, around the dates, when the dates are premature. They're not yet grown. They're very small. And yet, Rav Nachman says, in the name of Rabbah, that these dates that are covered by husks and are very immature are asiri. They're included in the Torah's isur of Peros Shel Orla. And what's the underlying logic of this sheet of Rabbah that even when the dates are very immature, nevertheless, we still consider them peros, and they are included in the Isur Orla, and therefore hence in the Isur of Liachav v'lo lehefsed and Shvius. It's Hol v'nasu shomer lepri. The very fact that in nature these husks already have grown and they cover the pri, the reason for that in nature is to protect the pri. It's already considered a pri. Shomer leperi, emas havi bekufre. Even when it's in this early stage of kufre, it's only a bud, a beginning of a date, and nevertheless it's covered by husks. That's called kufri. It's still asa b'arla, says Rav Nachman in the name of Rabbah, which means that when it has the shomer lepri, it's got to. If it didn't have the status of a pri, then it wouldn't have husks to protect it. Because what happens is, and this is the Gemara's proof that we're talking about a very early stage in the maturation of the tamarim of the dates, the very fact that the husks are still attached to these kufri is proof positive that we are aschuli, we're at a very early stage. Because what happens is, as the fruit on the tree develops and matures, the husks naturally fall off. The pri can handle it on its own. Whatever the natural, challenges are, the rains, etc., natural forces, the pri is already a pri on its own. It's matured, and it's large enough to be protected without the husks. The husks will naturally fall off. If there are husks, then you know that it's in a very early stage. And that's what kufri is all about. So the Gemara therefore postulates that Rabbi Eloi illegally cut down this tree of Shvius because already at that early stage of kufri, the payros had the status of a pri. And once it has the status of a pri, it's no longer an eitz. And the Torah says, li'achla v'lo lehefsid, even though it's not really edible at this stage, but it has the potential of becoming edible. And that gives it a shame pri. The kakarilu peri. And Rav Nachman says that these kafnios are peros. Haraya, he says they are prohibited under the Isur Orla. And therefore, ipso facto, if kafnios are considered free, then how could Rav Eloi possibly cut down the tree which will be mafsid these kafnios? And the Torah says you're not allowed to be mafsid peros of Shvius. I just want to make one comment. We should keep our tentacles up here, because is it possible that there's a difference between Orla and Shvius? The Gemara never questions that premise. Again, it's a gigantically long sugya here. But at no point does the Gemara say, well, there's a separate shame pri vis-a-vis Shvius and a separate shame pri vis-a-vis Orla. I could have been comfortable with that distinction and say what the Torah says with regard to Shvius. The pasuk says, maybe it means li'achla, when right now it's already mature enough to market it and eat it. And lo lehefsid. But Orla might be totally in a shame pri. So you may have, but the Gemara, I'm just telling you up front, I was very disappointed. I thought I had a brilliant copy, but the Gemara doesn't suggest that. So the underlying premise of this Gemara, the analogy is that whatever is considered shame pri linyan Isur Orla is ipso facto as a shame pri linyan Isur lehefsid, as far as Shvius is concerned. So now what the Gemara is going to do is the Gemara is going to present a machlokas tanoim about the issue of kafnios and the kufri that grow on the kafni on the kafnaisa, the kafnios. And although Rav Nachman took one approach and accepted one opinion in Tanoim, that's not Machayev Rav Eloi. Rav Eloi could take the other opinion, Lakula, that at this early stage of kufri, we don't have a shame pri, therefore it's not also bi'arla, therefore it's not also hefsed shvi. Of Nachman, the Omer Rav Yossi, although it's true that Rav Nachman accepted the chumrah of Rav Yossi, but the Rabbanan argued against Rav Yossi, and therefore Rav Eloi can fall back on the shita of the Rabbanan. So where is this machlokas between Rav Yossi and the Chacham? It's at the very beginning of Masechta Orla. The Snan, Rav Yossi Omer, Smodar Osur Mipnei Shehu Peri. Now, Rabbosai, this I remember from Rav Soloveitchik years ago. Yeah, I don't remember much, but this one I remember. That there's something. Now, I'll tell you where we heard it from Rav Soloveitchik. There's something called Smodar and there's something called Bosar. And these always confuse my mind, like which came first. So I made myself a little bit of a device. It's the opposite. The Samach, which comes after the Beis, in this case, it's the reverse. The Smodar comes before Bosar. And when you're learning Zerayim, this is like, I say, it's like the most basic terminology all across Zerayim is to differentiate between Bosar and Smodar. So we had it in Perek Cheskes Abatim. I don't know if any of you gentlemen were there when the Rav taught Cheskes Abatim. Anybody? You're a little bit before that time, after that time, I don't know. So in Cheskes Abatim, the law is that the machzik, in order to prove that he purchased the land, that he doesn't have a shtar to prove it, says, he has to work the land and reap its benefits for 3 years consecutively. And there was no mecha on the part of the original Murakami. So the Gemara goes through, well, what happens if he cuts down the payros prematurely? For example, he cuts it down when it's bosar. And then the Gemara has another sugya, what happens if he cuts it down when it's smada, which is an even earlier stage? Because hochachas bailus means that I did it the way everyone else does it. But here he cut down the fruits pretty early on the tree. Anyway, there are different kinds of date trees. It becomes very complicated, and Rav Soloveitchik was working very hard to try to fit that sugya into Zroim. Now, I didn't have time to research this, and also my library is a little bit of in a balagan here. But if you have access to what's called Chidushei Agram V'Agrid, which is published by Moriah, it's a collection of, I think, about 8 pieces, essays that Rav Moshe Soloveitchik published, and maybe 20 or more essays that Rav Soloveitchik himself published. Most of them were published in what's it called?
Pardes.
Pardes, right? Pardes, yeah. What was his name? He's not alive anymore.
Elbaum or something?
Elbaum, yeah, Elbaum. Yeah, Elbaum's Pardes. So anyway, the Rav has a whole piece there on the difference between Trumas and Maisris and other Zraim, as far as Smadar and Bosar. Honestly, I didn't have the time even to find the Sefer. I know I have it here somewhere, but so you're all invited to research that. So Rabbi Yossi goes as far as saying that in Arla, Smadar, which is again the first budding of the dates on the date tree, is already also Mishum Arla. And why? Neshu Pri. It has the din of a Pri. It's Peri. And once it's Peri, it's Peris of Arla. And the Gemara assumes, therefore, ipso facto, it's going to be also to cut down the tree when it has fruits that are only Smadar. And that violates the Isur of Li'achla V'lo Lehefs. Upligi Rabbanan Aleh. However, in that Mishnah at the beginning of Arla, the Chacham reject this idea. They hold that Smadar is mutar bi Arla, because the Rabbanan hold that Smadar is too early and it's not considered pre, it's considered eitz. And therefore, if it doesn't even have that Gemar pre of the first stage, and it's covered by these husks, as we said before. So Rav Eloi, by cutting down the Shmias tree, a palm tree that had kufri on it, kufri equals Smadar. Chachamim deny the status of pri in the case of Smadar. So Rav Eloi, although Rav Yossi would have objected, he was okay to rely on the Shitas Chachamim. And at this point, the Gemara is going to quote a Mishnah Shvius, and based on this Mishnah Shvius, the Gemara is going to prove that even the Rabbanan agree to Rabbi Yossi's position that Smadar has a shame peri, and therefore Rav Eloi could not rely, and he did not have a fallback position to rely on the Rabbanan. The real challenge is to figure out this Mishnah in Shvius. So what I'm going to suggest is we're going to do a fudge job and just try to, again, we'll have to pick up the pieces, but to try to get the main thrust of what the Gemara wants to derive from the Mishnah in Shvius, and so far as it's relevant to Rav Eloi and the whole story about his cutting down the date tree. And then what we have to do, that's really challenging, is go through this Mishnah. The Gemara quotes the Mishnah piece by piece, detail by detail. So the Gemara says, Maskif la Rav Shimi minar doyu mi pligi Rabbanan alei Rav Yossi. You're assuming that the Rabbanan rejected Rabbi Yossi's definition of Smadar. as having a Shem Peri. That's not true. Why? Because we have something called Bishar Ilonos. Meaning that although the Mishnah in Arlon, first parak of Arlon, does record a machlok between Rabbi Yossi and the Chacham regarding Smodar, but that's only as far as Anovim are concerned, as far as grapes are concerned. But our sugya here of Rav Eloi is dealing with tmarim, with dates, not with grapes. And with regard to Shar Ilonos, with the exception of a vine, even the Chachamim accepted the principle that Smodar is a Shem Pri. And it's also Bi'arla, and ipso facto, it's Aser and Shvius Midin Li'achla V'lo Lehefs. Umi pligi alei to Rabbi Yossi b'shari lonos. Do the Chachamim reject Rabbi Yossi's definition of smodar with regard to a date tree, for example? That's not so. But Tnan, now we're learning Shvius. Before we were learning Arla, now we're learning Shvius. They aim asai aim kotzitzim es ha'ilonos b'shvius. Is Beishamai Omrim Kol Ha'ilonos Mishiotziu. Mishiotziu is a very early stage. The actual literal translation of the word Mishiotziu is a reference to the leaves. And the leaves show up on the tree even before the fruit grows on the tree. So certainly we're in a very early stage. Now again, this is not going to be so in the case of grapes. But we're talking about Shar Ilonos. So you see, and I'm waiting for you to slug up what I'm about to say, you see that in Shar Ilonos, the Chachamim accepted the Shem Pri at a very, very early stage. So of course you're going to tell me to fly a kite, because that's only Beit Shammai. But we're going to see soon that Beis Hillel agree with Beit Shammai on this particular point. There will be a plukta between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai with regard to grapes and perhaps a few other kinds of trees, a very limited, shall I say, membership club. But as far as all Ilanos, including date trees, are concerned, Beis Hillel accepted Beit Shammai's definition of Misha Yotziu. Now, Rashi introduces another element here to the equation, which has to be studied, but he talks about different months of the year. And he says that this Mishiotziu, when the leaves begin to show up on the trees, that's in the days of Nisan. Okay, fine. So we're at the end of the winter. We passed the winter with the beginning of the spring. And that's when we see in Chodesh Nisan, as you know, we go out there, we see the Peros Bailanos, that's the early stage. That's called Chodesh Nisan. Okay, so Rashi identifies that as Chodesh Nisan. Now, Beis Hillel, which we're about to learn in the Mishnah in Shvius, are going to disagree with Beit Shammai, but only with regard to two select trees, or two fruits, if you will. Charuvim and Gefonim. Charuvim are we call carob trees. I think in Yiddish we used to call it boxer. I don't know if that means anything to anybody. Misha Yisharshu. In other words, according to Beis Hillel, Charuvim, which I remember from my early days, Charuvim is a separate topic in Zroim. They require a later stage, which means they look like sharcharos. If you've seen the way that the carob tree grows, the fruits look like little round chains almost. And Gefonim, here we turn to Daf Nun Gimel, Misha Yig Yigareu. Yigareu. Okay, Yigareu means when the grapes develop a little bit. And the Gemara later on is going to quote Rav Asi to interpret the word Misha Yigareu. Oh, now he has a third. I made a mistake. I said there were only two. Beis Hillel is going to argue against Beit Shammai in a third tree, and that's Zaysim, an olive tree, Misha Yonetzu. When the growth of the tree is such that they have a certain covering, a klipa. That klipa is called the nets. I think Shir Hashirim discusses this. In any event, but v'shar kol ilonos, including date trees, is Beis Hillel concedes to Beit Shammai that Mishiotziu, it's already at the early stage. So now we're going to see how Rav Shimi Minardoi develops his question, his objection against Rabbi Eloi, who cut down this tree based on this Mishnah. But first we have to figure out what Misha Yigareu means. The Omar Rav Asi, with regard, again, keep in mind, we're talking now about grapes. With regard to grapes, Rav Asi says, Hu Bosar, Hu Gerua. That the word Gerua, which is the noun of Mishi Yigreu, when they come out with this Gerua, is identical with the word Bosar, which, as we said before, is a later stage, but again, that's only with regard to grapes. And Hu Pul Halavan. It's a white bean. That makes no sense whatsoever. What do you mean it's a white bean? We're talking about grapes. We're not talking about beans. Pul Halavan Talkadaitik, we have to sort of rewrite the text of Rav Asi. Ela Emo Shiuro Kipul Halavan. That this stage, this developed stage, which is called Osar, where you could see the grapes already at the size of a pul halavan. In any event, it's clear that Misha Yigareu, according to Rav Asi, is not to be identified with Smadar, but rather with Bosar, a later stage. And that would mean that Shar Kol Ilonos, even when they reach the state of Bosar, no, I'm sorry, just the opposite. But Shar Kol Ilonos do not have to reach the stage of Bosar, and even if they only reach the stage of Smadar, which is the language of Mishiotziu, they're already considered Arla, or in the case of Shvius, they're also Midin Kedusha Shvius. Uman Shamet Le Di Omar Bosar in Smadar Lo. Now we go back to the original Mishnah in Arla that was addressing the case of grapes. And Rav Asi said that already when it reaches the early stage of Smadar, it's already considered Arla, it's a peri. And the Chacham rejected that as codified in the Mishnah in Arla. So that we must therefore assume that the Mishnah in Shvius reflects the Shita of the Chachamim. Why? Because Man Shamet Lady Omar, who's the Tana who said that boats are in Smadar Lo, that in Orla, Smadar is not Osir because Smadar is not a pre, and we have to wait until when? Till Bosar. Rabbi Yossi said that already at the stage of Smadar, it's Osir Mishum Orla. The Chacham rejected it because they have to wait till Bosar. Ukitani, and nevertheless, it says in this Mishnah in Shvius, Shar Koli Lanos, including date trees, is Mishiotziu. Even at this earlier stage, not like the Gefanim, where we have to wait for Bosar, but even in an earlier stage, which is equal to Smadar, which is called in the language of the Mishnah Mishiotziu, it's already also to cut down the tree. And you're telling me that Rav Eloi was falling back on the sheet of the Chacham against Rabbi Yossi. Well, I have news for you. The Chachamim of Rabbi Yossi only waited for the next level, the next maturation date of Bosar in the case of Gefanim. That's where they disagreed with Rabbi Yossi. And in Gefen, reflecting the sheet of the Chachamim, like Beis Hillel in the Mishnah in Shvius, that it's only called a pre when it reaches the state of Bosar. That's regard to Anavim. But Shar Kol Ilonos, leaving out Charuvim and Zaysim for a minute, they are Mishiotziu. And what is Mishiotziu? Mishiotziu means that it's equivalent to the state of Smadar. If that be the case, then Rav Eloi would have been enjoined from cutting down the tree, which has kafnios, because kafnios have the status of smud, are equal to Smadar, both of which have the status of a pre. So now the Gemara reinterprets the whole story. We made a big boo-boo, and Rav Eloi did not cut down a tree and destroy those early bud dates on the tree. Now, here you have to know more botany than I know, but apparently there are two types of date trees. There's female date trees and male date trees. I think we touched on it in the past. Don't ask me when, but Ella Rabbi Eloi binischane cuts. He was cutting down a date tree, which was the male date tree, and the male date tree, when the fruits begin to blossom on the tree, they never really reach maturation. The only way that you can get the final product of these dates is by cutting them down when they're premature, so to speak. And there's a whole umnus that they put it in a certain kind of a sal, a basket that was made of lulav branches. And over the course of time, these dates would mature. So therefore, he's not violating the Isser of Hefsed Peros Shvius. On the contrary, he's doing exactly what you do with Peros Shvius. And that is that you cut these down from a male date tree, and you take the tamarim. They will never mature on the tree. They will only mature through this process of putting them in the salim, in the baskets. And therefore, when he cut down the tree, he was not mafsid the pears in any way. Pears would never have matured on the tree. So that, the Havamina, the Gemara, and the Maskana really revolves around a very fundamental issue. And that is, what is the halachic status in Zroim of Smadar? Is it a machlokas between Rav Yossi and the Chachamim? And the Gemara thought initially, well, we could justify Rav Eloi by claiming that was Smadar, and Smadar is too early, and it's not a Shem Pri. But the Gemara says now that with regard to Ruba de Ruba of Ilanos, even the Chachamim accepted the sheet of Rav Yossi, that we don't have to wait till Bosar, but the Shem Pri emerges with Smadar. And when Rabbi Yossi was taken to task by the Chachamim who disagreed with him with regard to Arla in Smadar, that machlokus was limited to the case of grapes, and it's really a repeat of the machlokus in Shvius between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai about grapes and two other trees. But fundamentally, with regard to other trees, even the Rabbanan, even Beis Hillel agree that once it reaches the state of Smadar, it's already got a Shem Pri, and it's also Bi'arla, but it's also in Ktzitas HaIlon of Shvius. And therefore, the Gemara has to make a complete turnabout in order to justify Rav Eloi and assume that he was not cutting down your run-of-the-mill palm trees, date trees, which, by cutting them down prematurely, once they have a Shem Pri, namely Smadar, even though they're still covered by those husks, if you remember, he violates the Isser of Liachla of Velola Hefseid, but rather, Rav Eloi cut down a different kind of date tree, and Adarabbi, he was doing exactly what we have to do with a date tree, or with those dates on the tree, and we have to cut them down. So Rabosa, as I say, this is the beginning of Shvius. I mean, meaning this sugi goes on and on with the details of Shvius. We learned in the Brisa, Ochlim ba'anavim, we talk about anavim Shvius, ad sheyichlu dolios shel ochel. Okay, now ochel is the name of a place, and dolios are apparently those grapes, if I understand correctly, that are sort of hanging on top of the vine. Let me just see for a moment. He gives us a little botany here. Where are we? Not in Gimel. He says that the vine arbors. Okay, I don't have a Merriam-Webster dictionary to look up the word arbors. If somebody could, Arbor. I guess those are the branches of the vine. Anyway, in Ochel, which is the name of a place, Yichlu is Kol L'Chayim in Asad, right? So it's he calls it depleted. Okay, does he tell us what these vine arbors are? Okay, I don't know. So that's called Dolio. So I didn't understand the Hebrew and I don't understand the English. So I'm in great shape. You know, Dr. Chaim would throw me out of class for this, but okay, I didn't prepare this part of the sugya. I didn't get that far. So he says, "Im yeshmu ucharos mehen." Okay, so there are other dolios that mature at a later date. Then ochlin alein. Then there's no chiyuv biur. And ochlin bezesim. Where's the latest place in Eretz Yisrael that you'll find olives on the tree? Ad sheyichle achron shebeskoa. So again, if you talk about grapes, you want to go to a place called Ochel. If you want to go with olives, you go to Tekoa. I again, don't fault me for this, but I don't believe that this is the Tekoa of today. I mean, maybe it's a general area, but Tekoa in Chazal is right next door to Beit Lechem. I don't know. Anyway, so we have different shiurim and different peros as far as beer is concerned. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, he has a different location. Ad sheyichla achron shel gush chalav. So as far as the olives are concerned, there'll still be olives in a place called Gush Chalav. These are the last ones to go. He writes in the English that this area is located in the tribal territory of Asher, which was rich in olive trees. Oh, look at this footnote. He says Tekoa was a town near Beit Lechem, surrounded by olive groves. Its trees produce superior olive oil. Oh, very good. He tells you, look at menachos. You know, you needed shemen zayis for the menachos, so they took it from Tekoa. Fine. And then he says, Kadesh Yehei Ani Yotze. So again, we have olives in the house, and they have Kedusha Shvius, and we don't have to give the ani those olives. We can continue to eat from these until the last olive grove in Gush Chalav has been depleted. The Eno Motzi Lo Benofo Velo Beikro Rova. So in other words, you want to know about of a certain volume, okay, it's equal to Shisha Beitzim, called a Rova, and these branches of the last trees that are producing olives cannot produce a Rova. Maybe you get a few last olives, but not enough to be considered local l'chayim in the ilu. Now he talks about figs, Oakland, Begrogos, Achi Yichlu, Page, Beis Hine. So the last place to find figs is in a place called Beis Hine. He says in the footnote, Beis Hine was located near Yerushalayim, and its trees produced stunted figs. That doesn't sound so exciting, stunted figs. But anyway, I guess those were the last figs to be available, and therefore it's considered kol l'chaim in asad. Oh, now this is the next piece of Gemara is very lomdish. Amar Rabbi Yehuda lo huskru pagi beis hini el inyan maser. And it sounds like he's making a distinction here between maser and shmitz. So that has to be understood. Then there's a place called Tzoar, and that's the last place where you'll find palm trees that are producing dates. Okay, then. So this is, as I said before, a sugya of Shvius. The next sugya is a sugya about behema daka and behema gasa. And the Chacham made a gzera that we're not allowed to sell a behema gasa, a larger animal like an ox, to the goyim, because we're always afraid that if you allow selling these animals to goyim, then people will come to rent them and lend them out to goyim, and that's an Isra on Shabbos of Shvisas Behemto. He's not allowed to have his animal work. So technically, according to the strict letter of the law, he can sell an ox to a guy, but the Rabbanan are afraid if we let him sell an ox to a guy, then he will come to rent out his ox to a guy for rental fee. And that'll be a violation of the mitzvah of Shvisas Behemta. However, do we go as far as to prohibit selling a behema daka, a smaller animal like a sheep or a goat, to a guy? And this was totally in minhag. Some accepted the minhag that we don't sell animals to goyim. Not only do we abstain from selling larger animals, even smaller animals, and others say, no, smaller animals are okay because you don't usually generally rent out these smaller animals. They're not work animals. Now, exactly why there was a minhag to prohibit even behema daka, that's a gigantic machlokes. But I said at the outset, we're going to take a break from Makom Shenagu. I'm going to try to teach it really fast to a different group. That's my 7:30 shir. And for our purposes, to try to get a little bit more into the Pesachim B'Iyun, we're going to skip to a parak about Slias, Korban Pesach on Daf Ayin Dal. And it'll be an experiment. I mean, I may come back to you tomorrow and tell you, Lo alachli. I tried for hours and I couldn't figure it out. But I think, because I was told by my friend Rabbi Yilson, that the kodshim of Pesachim is a little bit easier. So I learned Zvachim. I don't know if any of you remember that I taught Zvachim in the Amek Learning Center, and it was pretty challenging. So I'm hoping that that'll give you a little bit of an orientation. We'll be able to cover various dimensions of the Korban Pesach. Okay, then? All right. So everyone should have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.